Hello, everyone, and welcome to another installment of City Lights Live, the online edition of the City Lights events calendar. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis, and today we are delighted to welcome back into the house Ayana Mathis, celebrating the publication of her new novel titled The Unsettled. It is brought to us by our friends over at Alfred A Knopf. A new novel by Ayana Mathis is always an occasion. We've been following her work with great enthusiasm over the years, and it is a great honor to have her with us here again. Before we begin, as is customary at the outset of each event, I would like to acknowledge we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. We'd like to take this moment to offer our respects to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. Ayana Mathis is the best-selling author of the novel The 12 Tribes of Hattie, which was an NPR Best Book as well as an Oprah Book Club selection. It has been translated into 16 languages. Her nonfiction has been published in such places as the New York Times, The Atlantic, Guernica, and Rolling Stone. Joining her today in conversation is Angela Flournoy. She is the author of The Turner House, which won the VCU Cabell First Novel Prize, as well as being a finalist for the National Book Award, amongst other honors. She's a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine, and her nonfiction has appeared in numerous publications. These include The Nation, the Los Angeles Times, and The New Yorker. So join us now in giving a warm welcome to Ayana Mathis in conversation with Angela Flournoy. Welcome to you both. Welcome to everyone in the audience. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, hello, hello. Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. Hi, Angela.
Hi, so happy to see you.
Yes, indeed, indeed.
Well,
first
of all, I would like
to.
I would like to say congratulations to you on this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful book. And I was hoping that before our conversation got started, because I have so many things I'd like to talk to you about, if you would do us the honor of reading a little bit of The Unsettled.
I would be very, very happy to. I should also say that Angela is my dear friend, as well as being, and I posted somewhere on some social media that the best thing about book tours is that you get to talk to all your brilliant friends, which is a really wonderful thing. Okay, so I will read briefly from two different sections. The novel has essentially two poles. One is Philadelphia. It's set in the 1980s. One is Philadelphia. And the other one is a fictional sort of dying town called Bonaparte, which is set on a bend in the Alabama River. It's the voices of the novel kind of go very well with the places in the novel. So one voice is Duchess, who is a retired, formerly itinerant blues singer who lives still in Bonaparte, in this place in Alabama, and is kind of trying to preserve the legacy of this town. And hold on to the land, though it faces many, many threats. And then there's her daughter, whose name is Ava, who has left Bonaparte when she was a very young woman, and after some wandering around, settles in Philadelphia, where she has a son named Toussaint. And those three characters are sort of the main voices in the novel. So the first section I'm going to read is very early on in the book. This is Duchess's voice, and she's talking about, she had told us about the grandeur that was Bonaparte, and now she's going to tell us sort of how it is now. There's nobody left here now. Cows, graves, me. There's not but 1,000 acres of Bonaparte left between us. Us is Carter Lee and his wife Juniata, Mema and Nip LaPrairie, and Irma Linner. Bonaparte was 10,000 acres once upon a time. 10,000 free nigger acres. Hear that. The records are across the river in Bodine at the Pauline County Courthouse. All of us, Carsons, Moores, Bennies, Dukes, Linners, Jameses, Coopers, Billupses, Bells, Peets, LaPrairie's, Hunleys, Greens, Camdens, and Richards, all our deeds and property surveys and tax records, alongside the records of the white folks' thieveries, which they like to call bills of sale or sometimes foreclosure, depending on how they do the stealing. There's 9,000 acres lost, if you can stomach the count. Nobody left around here can stand to hear it. You can't blame him. Irma Linner used to have 600 acres all on her own, but her no-account crackhead son sold them off piece by piece so they could suck it up a pipe, gamble dice, and then move to Washington, D.C., where If there's any justice in the universe, they are dead in an alley. I do my best to keep up morale and get us to stick together. But you can lead a donkey right down to the water's edge, but the motherfucker still might kick you in the head. One thing is the same. Carter Lee is still the postmaster, even if he is 194 years old, and it's just him riding geriatric on his moldy motorboat to get the mail from the depot in Bodine across the river. Over there, it's just white folks as far as the eye can see, with a few lost Negroes who ain't had better sense than to come to Bonaparte years ago when they still had the chance. Maybe they gloat now that Bonaparte's a ghost town. Probably. Niggers love a come down. Back in the day, they fold and fold around here. Duchess, they used to say, you ain't gonna have but that one? Aw. Then the kids grew up and went off, and the mamas sat up on their porches in their sackcloth and ashes, mooning over pictures of the grown children. I used to say, what'd you expect? Nothing for a young person to do around here but watch the kudzu grow over the fence. Now we are just a rutted dirt road between two live oaks, trailing off into the woods like a whistle in the wind. Adio, Bonaparte. We had a town placard, Bonaparte, Alabama, Negro Incorporated Town, established 1868. Used to be Caro, redid it every few years and kept it staked out on the road by the oaks. Till a few years ago, the white folks never touched it. They thought it was cursed. White folks ain't scared of nothing as much as they scared of niggers with spells. Progress Corps pulled it up like a weed and threw it face down in the dirt. Me and Carter Lee moved it to the front of the old Bonaparte General Store. Yeah, we had a store too. Nothing in there now but the shelves, but we're still proud of what it was. We have our little 4-family town meetings in there too. This is our church, Carter Lee said one time. Stupid Juniata shushed him up like God was going to strike him. After that, me and Carter Lee repainted the lettering across the front, Bonaparte General. Took us 2 weeks and our old behinds nearly met our maker, but we did it. Mema and Nip sat in folding chairs and watched us, lazy coloreds. At least they brought lemonade. I'll stop there, and I'm gonna move into another section with another voice. This is her daughter, very different voice. Her daughter's name is Ava, as I said. And when we meet Ava in the first half of the book, she's living in a homeless shelter with her son, Toussaint. And she's trying to figure out how to get out of the homeless shelter, as one would. But she's sort of stymied, both by her own proclivities, her past, and by a concussion that she receives at the hands of her rather unwieldy ex-husband, whose name is Abemi. And that the dissolution of that marriage is what led her to the homeless shelter. Anyway, when we meet her in this excerpt I'm going to read, she's at the library in a phone booth. She's gone there to, remember it's the 80s, so that's the phone booth. So she's gone there to circle want ads. Again, it's the 80s in the paper and kind of make some calls to see if she can get herself a job. But this chapter is called An Electrical Experience. The other name that will be mentioned is Cass, who is an ex of hers, who is also the father of her son, who is in Philadelphia somewhere, but she doesn't know where he is. An Electrical Experience. After Bell Telephone, where Ava had an interview that went badly. After Bell Telephone, Ava decided to take matters into her own hands. She sat in a phone booth at the library on Shelton Avenue, calling through the want ads. Secretary, clerical assistant, collections agent. The problem was, she didn't have a callback number besides the service desk at Glen Avenue Shelter, where Sherry, the secretary, was supposed to answer the phone discreetly and say, so-and-so isn't available right now. May I take a message? Ava never got any messages. Maybe it was time she applied to McDonald's. She was thinking about how people are always saying how they'd take any job at all if their back was against the wall. Funny how the McDonald's and the Wawa weren't overrun with all those noble, hard-working folks. There sure were a lot of people with their backs against the wall these days. Outside the phone booth, a row of overhead lights brightened, then popped like a fuse had blown. Ava felt dizzy. Pain whipped across her forehead. She fainted, maybe. When the worst had passed, she opened her eyes to find she was holding on to the little shelf in the phone booth. her change spilled all over the floor and the blood beating in her ears. She sat up and took a few deep breaths. Her headaches were like a visitation, like seeing a ghost, which is an electrical experience and hurts like hell, even though people never mention the pain. She probably ought to see a doctor. Where was old Cass with his bag of pills when you needed him? Ha ha. You love to push a pill, she said to the Cass in her mind. Remember that time when I was at Temple and I had finals and I wasn't going to make it between the studying and the working nights and the going out with you, and you gave me those little white pills? Off she'd gone to her exam 2 days later, energized. Everything there was to know about toddler language development organized in little files in her brain. No sweat. But a few blocks from the subway, the sidewalk tilted skyward and her heart tried to bang its way right out of her chest. She called Cass during his shift at the Black Panther HQ. I'm having a heart attack, she said. He told her to go to a diner, have a glass of milk and 2 pieces of buttered toast, and wait 10 minutes. Well, she was fit as a fiddle after that, if a little shaky, and an A+ on the final. When she asked him about the pills later, Cass had said, oh, they were just bennies. Passed your exam though, didn't you? You bastard, she said. You quack. That got him. They lay in Ava's bed laughing so hard their bellies ached. They laughed till they were too worn out for anything but sleep. She woke in the night to Cass kissing her eyelids very softly, so softly that the recollection felt like a dream. He could be sweet like that in the dead of night, or when he showed up one winter afternoon with a mink hat because she'd kept getting colds that year. Maybe, Ava thought, magically, ridiculously, Ava thought, the Panther Clinic had been reopened and Cass would somehow be there to cure her of this electrocuted feeling she had now. He was somewhere in the city. Ava could feel him wafting toward her like gardenia on a breeze. It was time to go back to Glen Avenue. Ava needed to lie down. She gathered her pencil and newspapers and walked to the bus stop on shaky legs. On the bus, her headache ruptured into darts of white light. I'm on the road to Damascus, she thought. Back at Glen Avenue, Ava made her way to the nurse's office. A handful of people waited in folding chairs in the antiseptic-smelling hallway. The worst of her headache had passed, but Ava's temples throbbed in time with her heartbeat. 30 minutes passed, then an hour. The faces in the chairs changed, but Ava was not called. A couple of girls with babies came and went. A woman dragged along a kid with a nosebleed. Damn it, Mickey, the woman said, damn it. She looked at Ava and said, they're going to say it's my fault. They'll take your kids in here. She put her hand gently on the back of the boy's bed. Tilt your head, tilt your head, baby. A steady stream of people entered the office with their infirmities and came out cured, or better at least. It must be satisfying to patch people up, Ava thought. Fixing things. It wasn't so hard to fix things. You just needed the right solution. A baby, Ava had come to understand in her concussed state, was not the solution. Of course, the other thing is you have to be able to stomach the solution or figure out how to stomach it in the absence of other options. Next, the nurse called at last. Ava stood. No, thank you. I'm okay. I think I have to call my mother. Is what I have to do. And she was gone down the hallway. The nurse didn't blink an eye. Lots of things the resident said didn't make any sense to her. She was supposed to report erratic behavior, not to mention all the rule breakers hanging around the building when they were supposed to be out looking for work. But honestly, who had the time? I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Just hearing you read just reminded me of how like a beautiful, complex, and layered book this is, which is, for me as a reader, is just really exciting to think about, and as a writer, to think about all of the different parts of it, right? And how it all really coheres. And I also would be remiss not to acknowledge that it took some time, right? To put it all together. I just would love to hear more about your journey to this book as a place to begin our conversation. As a person who is also taking some time on my second novel, how did you do it?
So it did indeed take some time. I mean, I guess, so we're about 11 years almost from Hattie, from my first novel, The 12 Tribes of Hattie. And this book, I think, probably 8 to 9, I guess. So I think a few things happened. I think, first of all, and Angela, obviously you can relate to this, when you have a first novel that gets really noisy, for me, it was obviously a blessing, that goes without saying. But, as the old saying goes, there's no such thing as a free lunch. And so the cost for the free lunch, the cost for the lunch was that, writing is such a private thing in many ways, and it requires such privacy of the mind, I think, also probably of the body too, but certainly of the mind, and a certain amount of quiet. And that was gone. It was, I couldn't, I would find, I must have started this novel 20, 25 times. I mean, I started it a lot of times. And one of the things that would happen is, well, the main thing that would happen is that I would get to a certain point, and, in order to be able to continue, you have to be able to make some sort of assessment, some sort of judgment of the work, some kind of decisions about how to go forward. And when I was alone in my quote unquote privacy, all I heard was like the New York Times and the Washington Post and Lit Hub, and it was just all these voices that had kind of hijacked my own ability to discern anything, or to hear my own voice even. And so I would get to a point, and then I would kind of be like, the Washington Post wouldn't like this sentence. Oprah would never pick a paragraph like that, and so all these sorts of things, right? I'm joking, but also not, there were these things about like, oh, it's bad, but also just, I didn't know what to do. Like I had lost any kind of compass. So I couldn't find a way forward, literally lost direction. And it just took a long time to get any of that back. It took a long time for everything to quiet down. And in some ways, it quiets down because of time, right? Like it's both, it quiets in your own mind and it literally just quiets down. And then you have to go through the other part where you're like, nobody cares about me anymore, like your whatever happened to Baby Jane phase. And then, and then you can kind of move on. So it was just really mostly a lot of time. And then I guess as that was happening, like voices that were going to be a part of this novel, particularly Duchess, she was kind of the first to come in really loud and clear, sort of began to arrive. And there was enough quiet around me and in my own mind for me to hear them a little bit.
So from the beginning, you had the idea of this sort of novel. It was just a matter of like figuring out how to actually have the approach to do it. Okay, that's very impressive. So there wasn't like a time when it was like, okay, I have Duchess, but Duchess is going to be doing like, it's a different story completely. You always thought it was this relationship between like this mother and daughter, and this like, in many ways, this is it's a book. 12 Tribes of Hattie was I think a more kind of straightforward Great Migration story, the way people think about it. But this is also about one of the beautiful things that I think people glossed over in Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns is that people were going back and forth, right? Like,
exactly.
Those forays to the north did not always work out, right?
Exactly.
Sometimes you had to get on a bus, back to the peanut farm, unfortunately, or wherever. And this book seems much more interested in that kind of the messiness of like that exchange between, going north for this idea of, progress, which is also, the name of this development company in the South that's threatening this small Black town. So that was something that you were still interested in, and you knew from the beginning that was something that you wanted to grapple with.
I think I did. I mean, the other thing that I knew was, so I'm from Philadelphia, and I'm sure we'll get to this, but so the Philadelphia sections have there's a very particular kind of group that arises, that is a kind of super political, sort of entirely fictional group, but is an amalgam of a lot of things. And I imagine we'll talk about that later, so I won't get to that. But I did also know really early on that group in the North would be really pivotal and sort of central in the novel. and once I sort of began to figure out where Duchess belonged, or like what she was doing, I also sort of began to understand that those two places and the groups that sort of represent those places would be in some kind of conversation with each other. So in a certain way, like the subject matter, like the basic kind of ideas of like, what is this about, you know, kind of writ large, once it got quieter, that became not clear, but, you know, it was enough to work on. But all of the sort of like all the plot stuff, and it's a pretty plotty book as it turns out. All
Deliciously
the plot stuff,
plotty, I would say.
it's and the voices of some of the characters were just elusive and kept running away, and I think purposely. Like, I think they had it out for me for a while. But anyway, that's an aside.
I will say the characters who run away from me, I find those are the ones that readers are like, oh, I just felt like I knew this person so well. And I'm like,
isn't it hilarious?
How did they talk to you when I felt like they were never trying to talk to me?
Exactly. It's like quite the opposite. They're like, I am not speaking to you.
Right. But you kind of end up focusing on them and like cornering them a little bit more, I guess. So then on the page, it seems like something is coming through, even though to you, it's like, I can't figure you out.
Right.
It's just one of those many interesting sort of like transferences that happen when you're writing. So this book there's a way, because you have this character Duchess who seems like she's almost like, she just seems like she could be anywhere like the second half of the 20th century, like her personality.
Right.
But this is a pretty modern book, right? The great majority of it is set in 1985.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that a lot of people, one thing that I really was excited about when I started to just realize we were spending dedicated time in the 80s is that when we think about historical fiction, and particularly historical fiction around that's like focusing on African Americans, this is one of those decades that I feel like is not really delved into. I read earlier this year, Gail Jones' The Birdcatcher, which is a not new book, right? It was like when it first came out in the 80s, it didn't have an English language publisher. So it was only published in Germany. But so it just last year got an English language publisher. But it had the feeling, because I'd never read it before, a feeling like I was reading historical fiction. And actually I saw in its like Library of Congress list that they put, even though it's not, because she wrote it, then. But I'm just interested in your approach to writing about this period of time that is not, we're not steeped in a bunch of like, it's not where a lot of writers have been looking back to see what's there in the 80s, and thinking about like everything that a person brings, a Black person living in Philadelphia brings into the 80s from the decades prior.
Yeah. So the sort of the point of access in a certain way is also that, like, I'm from Philadelphia and I grew up in Philadelphia in the 80s. And the 80s were, and the 80s were probably the kind of like tweens into teens were some of the most tumultuous point of my life, kind of personally. And so this book is not about my life, but a lot of things happened in that period that when I looked back on them as an older person, not even now, but I think probably through the whole of my adult life, I've been trying to sort of dismantle them. Like what happened there, right? Like, we had some challenges around housing stability, we were poor, all this stuff was going on. And the answer to the 80s, in the 80s, the answer to that is, well, it's because you're Black. Like that was the answer in the 80s. It's because you're Black. That's why. So there was a lot of time of kind of being like, well, I don't think that's why, like that maybe, or rather it is, but not in the way that I was being told that it was, right?
Right.
And so I think I've spent a lot of my adult life kind of trying to understand what happened in those years when I was a child. And of course, when you begin that kind of journey, then you get to all sorts of things. You get to Reagan, you get to Reaganomics, you get to the many crises that happened in cities all over the place in the 80s, and you get to the AIDS crisis, you get to the crack epidemic, you get to all of these things that I think are actually in sort of more modern history kind of set the stage for where we are now, very much.
Absolutely.
And I think so, you know, one of the things that I started to think about a lot is, bear with me, it's going to seem like a massive aside, but I promise it isn't, or maybe it is. I think about the Reconstruction a lot, like the period after the Civil War. And one of the things that, and that actually sort of comes into play in a certain way in background for the Bonaparte sections, because that town has been there for a long, long, long time. Somewhat mythologically, it kind of comes into existence even during the slave years, and then it kind of rides its way all the way through. But, you know, independent Black towns like Bonaparte, or ones that Bonaparte was kind of modeled on loosely, there are a lot of these places that propped up during the Reconstruction, right? Like it's this amazing period in which there's a whole lot of anti-Black violence, like enormously, like there's lynchings, all these things are happening. And at the same time, there is this sort of, this 11-year window in which Black people are owning businesses, buying land, setting up towns, learning to read, having public office, you know, voting, all this stuff is happening. And then the thing that allowed the Reconstruction to happen, which was federal troops occupying the South, 11 years later, it ends. And the window closes, and then it's Plessy versus Ferguson, and then off we go to Jim Crow, et cetera, right? Like the world of the South, as we kind of have known it for many years, sort of restarts itself. And in some ways, I sort of think of the 80s as kind of analogous to that post-Reconstruction period. Like the 60s and 70s, there's all these freedom movements, right? There's all these Black liberation movements, there's the women's movement, there's the gay, you know, and on and on and on, right? And it wasn't perfect, it was tumultuous, it wasn't like everything was fixed, but there's this like window that opens of like hope, or like the possibility of something different. And then it's 1980 and Reagan gets elected, and it's gone. And so, and then all the things that sort of happened in the 80s, you know, I mean, mass incarceration, the super weaponization of police, you know, all these things, which were a little bit happening in the 70s, but they all just come into this kind of massive fruition in the 80s. And it sets the stage for sort of, so it sort of set my personal stage when I was a kid in that era. But it also, I think, sets the stage in many ways for where we are now. And it's interesting to me, like, as you brought up, like, I don't understand. I don't know why we don't sort of look at it more in those ways. I don't know if it's just that it's sort of too new, although when you think about it, I mean, this is 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 40 years, you know, it's a while back, but we
didn't feel like it.
Yeah, it doesn't, I know, right? It doesn't, right? But we seem to sort of overlook it, or we seem to isolate it into like individual crises, as opposed to sort of understanding that that era in a whole was sort of setting a stage, right? Like we'll think about like, oh, the AIDS epidemic, or there was crack, and we put them in these little separate baskets, you know what I mean? As opposed to, I think what was actually happening is that there was an amassing of a certain kind of political and therefore social reality that sets the stage for kind of for where we are now, very, very much. But for some reason, we don't think of it that way.
Well, you know, I would, as a millennial, say it's because Gen Xers are too cool to
I know, we won't talk.
They don't want to talk about it because, you know, you have millennials who were born during that time, like myself, or, you know, famously Kendrick Lamar, like he had a whole album about like being, you know, born in the 80s and like what that's like. But that's not the same as coming of age in the 80s. But you know, generational theories aside, one thing you point out about the things that were sort of they felt like they were potent, and they were like this part of this window of hope in the 70s is, well, there's like Black liberation, which certainly becomes a part of this novel, because you have the character Cass, who is we can call him a charismatic cult leader, right?
We can call him that.
Okay,
Yeah.
I think
that's
is
totally safe characterization.
All right. You know, sometimes writers, they're like, well, wait a minute, but I'm like, that is what that man is. He is, you know, he clearly sort of his ideologies were burnished, like in the Black Panther Party, and he has a sort of a way of bringing people in through like the language of Black liberation, even though it turns out what he has in mind is a lot more sort of self-aggrandizing and weird and particular to his own stuff, right? And then, but sort of dovetailing with that, you also have, you know, the womanist movement and like the Black feminist movement and the like radical Black feminist movement in the 70s. And one book that I was thinking about when I was reading your book, because it's just on my desk, it always is on my desk, but is Toni Cade Bambara's The Salt Eaters, right? Mm-hmm. Which is sort of all about that, like these two kinds of ideologies and the ways that they are working together, but then also often at odds, right? Which is like this sort of male-centered, very masculine, and in many ways patriarchal, sort of like what we think of when we think of the Black liberation movement. And then you have these radical Black feminists or just Black womanists who are often put into secondary roles or in supporting roles, right? And then when it feels like the 80s come and all of these things kind of feels like these windows for hope, or if they're feeling like liberation is like right here coming close down, like where does that leave everyone? So I'm just wondering if the books that you were thinking about, or just some of the writers you were thinking about as you kind of grappled with how to make all of this into like very enjoyable, which it is, fiction.
Definitely, it's funny you mentioned The Salt Eaters, because definitely that, like, I think a lot, I thought a lot about that. And there's a couple of stories in that book that I teach a lot of stories. So they're always like kind of in there, you know? Certainly also, you know, well, it's like how to begin. In terms of even though we don't really think of it in this way, but Sula a lot. Like Sula enormously, actually. What else was I sort of thinking about? In other kinds of ways, for other sorts of reasons, I'm a kind of Louise Erdrich super fan, Plague of Doves in particular. I mean, a super fan in general, but for this book, that book had just a lot of resonance around like land and place, as does Sula. I mean, you know, Sula is just, you know, obviously like a place like the Bottom is, do you know what I mean? Like, even though it is a Black place in a larger white place, and Bonaparte is a Black place in a Black place, you know what I mean? But still, and yet, like, very much that kind of, you know, other sorts of things like Zora Neale Hurston stuff, like obviously places like Eatonville, like come into play because this, you know, Bonaparte is this very particular Black place, but also, so representations of Black places as they are in Say Their Eyes Are Watching God, but also just in Zora Neale Hurston's life, right? Like it's no coincidence that this kind of colossal figure comes from this Black place, right? That is intentionally sort of founded as such. So like all of those, I think all of those writers and more, but those are, I'll stop there so I don't talk forever. Like those are definitely things that were in my mind as I was thinking about this book.
And I wonder, one of the things that I just, you know, you're my friend from Philly. I have other friends from Philly. And so I am aware, and it kind of reminds me just of what I felt like when I was writing about Detroit, which is a place that many Detroiters, there's a reason why they have a slogan, Detroit versus everybody, which a lot of people have taken, but Detroit's where they made up. Right. Because they feel like their story is never told, you know, properly, right? The burden of feeling like I am touching upon something that people have a collective, not just a memory of, but like a sensitivity about. And Cass, as charismatic cult leader, does create an organization, if we can call it an organization, that is that has some parallels with the MOVE organization, which was, well, you can tell us about it and just your thoughts about rendering that in fiction and like the sensitivities around something that people there feel like it still feels fresh to them.
So I'll start by explaining MOVE for a little, you know, for folks who might not have heard of it. Forgive me if many people have already. So MOVE was a radical Black separatist organization or movement, I guess, in Philadelphia that started in the 60s and actually is extant like right now. They still exist. But they were sort of more at the height of their activity in the 60s, very late 60s, 70s, and 80s. They were in many ways kind of ahead of their time. They were, they sort of took things from others of the Black liberation movements that were active at the time. So they believed in being sort of offensively and defensively armed, like they believed they needed to protect themselves, that sort of thing. They also, they did things like compost, they were vegetarians. They, which is, sort of before a lot of that was happening or that people knew about it really very much. They would tend to sort of move into a neighborhood, and they lived in row houses very often, and they would kind of make a compound in which they, so they had various economic activity, they would sell fruit from grocery store, they did all kinds of things like that. And they were right about a whole lot of things, as I think Cass is. Then they were also wrong about a lot of things. And they were difficult neighbors like that. And that's an important thing to say for where I'm sort of about to get to. Because they were, they would set up like water catchment systems in the row houses where they lived, which would include like rain barrels on a roof, but there would also be like guard towers on these roofs of the houses with which they lived. And they would sometimes just sort of yell at people through bullhorns about how they were, sheep and the system was grinding them down and all these sorts of things, which of course it was, but, people don't really want to hear that from a bullhorn when they're trying to like walk home, So in any case, they were targeted very much by the Philadelphia police and just by the sort of systems and powers that be in general in the city in those decades. And there were various points in which they would have standoffs with the police, the worst of which, and the one which, if people are familiar with them, they would know about, happened on Mother's Day in 1985. They were in a row house in a neighborhood of Philadelphia called Cobb's Creek, which incidentally at that time had the highest rate of, it was a lower middle class and working class Black neighborhood, which had the highest rate of Black home ownership in Philadelphia at the time. And so they lived in this row house there. They get in basically a 14-hour thereabouts armed standoff with the police, in which the police fired 10,000 rounds of bullets into this house. There were 13 people in the house at the time. The standoff siege,
including children, correct?
Yes, women and children included. The siege continues. At its sort of height, the police and the mayor, who was the mayor at the time was a man named Wilson Goode, who was the first elected Black mayor in Philadelphia. They're like, what do we do? And so they decide that the thing that they should do is to drop a C4 explosive from a helicopter onto the roof of this house, which they do. And the house, of course, goes up in flames. 2 people get out of the house, a woman named Ramona and a little boy named Birdie. Everyone in Move took the last name Africa. So it was Ramona Africa and Birdie Africa get out of the house. Birdie Africa in some ways is a little bit of a model for my Toussaint in my book. The other people in the house, 11 people in the house, 5 of whom who are children, burned to death. And then the fire spreads down the block. So it's just, it's just a conflagration. You have a block of people who are many, many people, something like it's almost 200 families are displaced. And the neighborhood is scarred still. There's a little plaque there that they'll just managed to put up a few years ago. The actual block where this happened was called Osage, is named Osage Avenue. And it's a scar. It's an open wound in Philadelphia. It still is. I don't know if it's ever not going to be. So I didn't want to tell that story exactly, right? Because I was like, I don't know that I have a right to try to tell it. Also, like, selfishly, I'm a fiction writer, so I wanted to be able to answer, or not answer, explore a lot of my questions about why Moved happened, how it happened, what all of the sort of extenuating circumstances and questions were, without being beholden to tell the story, and also without disrespecting. Ramona Africa is still alive. She's the last person in the house who is alive, but she is still alive now. Without respecting her memories and her experience, or the experiences of the people who died there. So in a way, my group, which is called ARC, headed by Cass, is kind of in conversation with what happened in to Move, but isn't that. And it also, I was interested in a lot of questions, like, why Black freedom is met with outsized state and police, in particular police violence, which is a thing that happens in the Philadelphia sections with ARC, but which is also a thing that happens at a certain point to Bonaparte in a different way, but it does happen. So I was interested in those questions. And I was also interested in questions about, just sort of regular stuff, like, why can't Black people living in a neighborhood just be regular? And what I mean by that is, like, so as I said, Move weren't great neighbors, like the actual Move, right? Weren't great neighbors. But that doesn't mean you should kill them, right? And it's obviously, and it also means that the people who live in the neighborhood who have an issue with these neighbors who they don't like, it should be well within your rights to kind of be like, I'm going to talk to my city council person, or I'm going to call a cop, or I'm going to do whatever to sort of complain because people are, it's smelly because they compost and a rat got in my house, whatever. I mean, these are normal things that in a civic society, citizens are able to do. But when these Black people do it, 11 people die, and they are literally bombed out of their homes. So, like, what, I mean, there are a lot of questions there, I guess, is what it, and I was interested in trying to think about those questions.
Mm-hmm. And I think that you did like a really wonderful job of thinking about how a community, just as you say, like, they have the presumption that, they pay their taxes or whatever, that they can like depend on the state, or in this case, the city, to be like, there are a few people towards the end that are like, yeah, I want them gone by any means necessary, but that is not like the majority sentiment. But the ways that, and that is something that, for the book to be 40, I cannot believe, almost years, like set 40 years ago, that is something that I think is still pretty like relevant today. This idea, like, you don't have the presumption like of a reasonable response when you bring in the state to sort of like mediate a problem that you have, which I think that you really handled that delicately in the book. And also, I think in general, when you're dealing with, as fiction writers, when you're dealing with something that does have an actual historical corollary, the exciting thing is that you don't have to think about exactly what happened. What your job is like, well, how might that have felt? And how can I transmit that to a reader? And I think that you did a really good job of figuring out, like, through narrative. And you also have to figure out like how to have interpersonal dramas that are not necessarily in the records that we have. Even if there are documentaries, et cetera, they're not the same as like what is going on in someone's brain that they never shared, right?
Right.
They just notice about another person living in this house with them, et cetera. And I think that is the thing that like fiction can do that is really unique and special. But it's also, as a writer, kind of scary, especially as a writer, with any kind of ties to the communities you write about, is like, I'm not trying to say that this is the definitive text, but again, my job is to think about what it felt like, So I had just one more question before we opened it up to everyone, to people who have questions. Let me see, are there questions in here? I think you're supposed to put your questions in the chat. So when I get some, then I will address them. But until then, I have my own. So I'm really interested on a craft level, the way that this book is designed. There are long periods of time where Duchess, who is in Alabama, is not in contact with the other characters in the book at all. But it feels like they're kind of like running alongside each other, and just how you kind of made that happen.
It was one of the other things that took a really long time. I mean, because so Bonaparte, where Duchess lives, is both kind of it's a spiritual homeland in many ways, and it's also, I think we froze for a second. Did I freeze? Okay, no, we're okay. Bonaparte, where Duchess lives, is both a spiritual homeland and an actual place, and it is also the place. I have to be careful here about spoilers. It is also the place that is sort of very central to the novel, let's say. And Ava comes from there. She won't go back for various reasons, much of which have to do with like just sort of intense beef and water under the bridge with her mother. And also some very tragic things happened there that she's kind of as Bonaparte sort of entered into the beginnings of its death throes, some really difficult things happened there that Ava kind of sort of can't deal with. And then, as I said, she's got all this stuff with her mom going on. And so she's never going to go back. She doesn't want to go back. But she sort of does, right? She's always looking for something that is like Bonaparte, something that is like independent and free and larger than life, and a figure that might be sort of like her mother was, who is larger than life, and her stepfather, Caro, who got mentioned in the excerpt, who was sort of a kind of de facto leader of this town when Ava was young. And so she's always sort of looking for that. And then, of course, her son is born in Philadelphia and is never actually, he's never had a homeland in that sense, right? He's sort of born in this kind of drifty sort of way. So in many ways, like, everyone in the novel is like looking to Bonaparte either as a model or as a refuge or as an actual place that they would like to sort of be in. And so I think even though Duchess and Ava are estranged for most of the novel, there was a lot of tricky work around placement, because the chapters kind of go, it'll be like a bunch of stuff happens in Philadelphia, and then you get a Bonaparte section, which is always in Duchess's first person voice, then Philadelphia, then Bonaparte. And so you kind of go back and forth like this. And a lot of it was was really kind of, there was a lot of rearranging, because I wanted it to be so that so that these places were sort of talking to each other, even if the women themselves were not talking to each other, the women being mother and daughter. And so there was a lot of sort of moving things around, or and imagistic things that might suggest something, in many ways it's a book of mirror images, I think, like ARC, the group that we have been talking about, seems to me to be a kind of dark mirror of Bonaparte. Like so there's a lot of imagistic stuff, and sometimes things even on the level of plot or event that almost repeat. And I think that's also how those places, even though the women are not speaking to each other, it's also how the places feel a little bit like they're in conversation with each other, because there's a lot of like repetition, which I hope a reader doesn't read as repetition, but is in fact repetition, and a lot of like mirror imaging.
I can see that. I think that's also, I'm just going to write a note to myself. That's very smart. We have a question from Carl S. Fantastic discussion. Looking forward to reading the novel. You should read it. It is great. I remember Move and the horror of the police action. Can you say more about how you work with the facts of what happened versus the artistic license you have creating a fictional version of it? How do you make choices between real and imagined details in the book?
It's a very good question. So I should say at the outset that one of the things that I find that I have to do just for myself as a writer is that I have to free myself from facts, or from too many facts, because if I don't, then I start to feel like I'm kind of painting by numbers. Essentially, my imagination will just freeze. And then I start to feel like I get in some kind of weird trap where it's like I'm writing an essay and not writing a piece of fiction. So in order to make the fiction, I have to necessarily sort of take like the barest scaffolding and then kind of give myself permission to move away from it. Otherwise, I sort of can't make anything. Like my imagination won't work. So that's the first thing. But then the second thing I think is that, as I said, as I was thinking about this, I was pretty clear all along. I was like, I do not want to tell Move. Like, I don't think that's my right. I don't want to step on that kind of territory. I don't want to pour salt in that wound. What I want is to ask a bunch of questions about it. And also what I want is to, as Angela was saying a little earlier, like I want to sort of plant whatever that story is inside of people, right? Like I tend to not work from here up. I've worked from here up, not from here down. So I wanted to kind of be like, what's it like to live in this sort of situation? What's it like for people with particular set of personalities, a particular set of needs that are their own entirely? What is that like to put them in this sort of situation? And then what are the challenges they face from within and without, right? Like, obviously, there's the big state violence stuff that we were talking about, and those kinds of constant threats. but other sorts of concerns when you start thinking about Black utopic communities, which in a certain sense, both Bonaparte and Arc try to be, how do you feed yourself? How do you keep the lights on? How do you educate the kids? Like, what are you eating? How do you make any money? All these sorts of things. What do you think about money? What is your relationship to the place where you live?
Where does everyone sleep?
What'd you say?
Where does everyone sleep?
Where does everyone sleep? Like all these like very basic things. And so and how it would be to set something like that up and what it would be like to navigate that. And so necessarily when you get into those sort of granular questions, and I do think like granularity is kind of the stuff of fiction in many ways, there is not necessarily an answer to those questions that I could, at least not in the move histories, that I could necessarily go to and sort of mine and be like, okay, well, I'm just going to transplant these facts into my fiction. That would be sort of thievery, I think, in a way, and a little fraudulent, but also, it also in some ways, often when we're talking about these kinds of histories, particularly these kinds of Black histories, the information isn't even there necessarily, even if I wanted it. So I don't know if I totally answered your question, but in terms of what I felt like I needed to do as an artist and what I felt like was my right to do or not to do between those two things, and also the set of questions I was interested in exploring between those three things, I ended up sort of organically having some boundaries, right? And some limitations about how much I would borrow or how much I would take. And then of course, I was real worried about it. I was worried about it for a long time. I was like, is this too much? Is it too little? And essentially, like, after a while, as you write your way through, you begin to at least come up with a set of answers that satisfy you for a time. And then sometimes you still have doubts. Was that too much? Was that too little? I don't know, but you make a bargain with yourself, and then at a certain point you got to stick to it. You're welcome.
Thank you also.
Thank you, girl.
And actually, our friends at City Lights have a question that reminds me that I wanted to mention. So you were talking about that, a little over a decade that you were thinking about this book and thinking about how to approach it, but also trying to figure out how to quiet everything else, the Washington Post and the New York Times of it all. But you were also getting a master's in divinity. Not a small thing. And I think that dovetails with the next question. Would you please elaborate about Afro-spirituality influences, how it influences your thought and your work?
So I am, and I should say, like, it sounds like I already got my degree in divinity, so I don't want to be a lie. I'm slowly getting my degree.
You got it.
I don't know yet. Yes. I have a PhD in God. It's an ongoing process and a study. Religion factors enormously, or thinking about religious ideas factors enormously in this book. And it did in Hattie also to some extent. It just sort of is in the ether of my mind. I tend to frame questions often through some sort of religious lens. I should clarify, like, I'm not a religious person per se. I grew up very religiously, but I am no longer. But I believe very deeply in belief. And I believe very deeply in like the role of belief in people's lives, the way it shapes them, the way it gives them meaning, the way it, for better and for worse, right? Like the way it sort of rituals, all of these sorts of things. In this book in particular, I don't know if it came up in the section that I read, it might have. But the people in Bonaparte very rarely refer to God as God. Like they don't necessarily use that word. Sometimes they do. But more often they refer to God as the everlasting, and it is both a resistance on their part, and I guess then on my part, to gender God. I didn't want he's, and I didn't think that these people would believe in God as he. Also thinking about their history, these are people that the long history of Bonaparte in particular. These are people that were brought to this land as enslaved people. Onto land, obviously, that was stolen from native people, in particular Muskogee, Choctaw. There's a kind of in that area, and Porch Creek Indians also. And so they I think that their belief system is a kind of amalgam, as happened between a received Christianity from, in my imagination, it's probably the French that brought them, because at that point, the US is not the US, right? Like, it's territories that are being fought over by various European groups. In my mind, the French might have brought them, maybe the English, but probably the French, thus the name. In any case, people who had a very Christian worldview would have mixed with the worldviews, that religious beliefs that they would have brought with them, would have mixed also with, in as much as Bonaparte became an independent place, there's a lot of native people that are coming in and out. Well, native people that remain. I mean, most of those people were dragged away in the Trail of Tears, so a lot of native people are gone, but there would have been some that remained. And so that their religious system, their religious beliefs, I guess I should say, end up being a kind of amalgam of those kinds of things. So there isn't a he that's a God. There isn't a sense of God as a being that one could gender, even possibly anyway. It's spirit, and it's also like in the trees and in the grass and in the river, in this sort of strange mythical old woman named Rhea, who kind of is a guardian of this place, you know. So it's a big mix of a kind of syncretized belief system, which is evidenced in various ways in the book, but probably most obviously in this name that they have for God, which is the everlasting as opposed to God.
Thank you. I think that is our time, but I had one final question for you, which is just about the title, Unsettled. The Unsettled, I think about, you read a part of that of Ava and Toussaint in the shelter. And I think about just living in, you know, this city that I live in, Los Angeles, which has probably an undercount of 70,000 people living unsettled or unhoused on the street. And I'm just thinking about the various meanings that you sort of imbued into that word when you were thinking about that title.
So I have to say that this book had another working title for years. And then at a certain point, I was like, that is not the title of this book. So then there was this frenzy. Like, I was almost done. And it was like, what are we going to call this book? And I was totally stuck, and I couldn't think of anything, and nobody could think of it. My editor could, nobody knew. And so I was talking to a wonderful writer, if people don't know her, you should, named Emily Rabateau. Emily is kind of a genius, particularly with titles, but just in general. And so we were texting. She knew a lot about the book, and we were texting, and I was like, how's that? Blah, 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 blah. And she was like, She's like, well, it's like people aren't, she's like, maybe you could play with like settlements and like kind of try and overturn the colonial, implications of a word like that. And I was like, yeah. Anyway, the point is, in like about 10 minutes of texting, Emily titled my book. So, and it is exactly right? Like, people in this book are unsettled on every level, right? Like, as you pointed out, Ava and Toussaint, quite literally so, when we meet them, are living in a homeless shelter. In some ways, I think of this book as people having different degrees of distance from home and legacy, and homeland, both quite literally, like a piece of land, but also a sort of homeland in their spirit and of their mind. And so everyone is unsettled. The Duchess is the most settled in a way, right? Because she's on Bonaparte, she's on that land and she's trying to preserve it, but it's threatened from all sides. It's threatened by this white development called Progress, this corporation. It's threatened by eminent domain. It's threatened by time. So she's holding on to it, but the land and the fate of that land is certainly unsettled. Her daughter is another sort of middle degree of unsettled. She had a place, then she leaves the place. And her son is like probably the most unsettled, right? He's the farthest from a sense of home and belonging. And then, of course, Ark, the place that they sort of end up aligning themselves with, is a place that attempts to make some kind of settling or settlement. It doesn't do a great job. So everyone in the book is sort of looking for, on both the level of actual physical land, on a political level, also on a level of family and love, is looking for belonging, and has not found that, and is sort of on some kind of journey to attempt to find it or to make it. And so people are unsettled both in terms of where they are physically and geographically, but also sort of where they are in terms of of family and of belonging, and of peace, I guess, in a way. And I think probably the larger question has to do with Black people in America, and what the extent to which we are unsettled.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's joined us and to City Lights for having us.
Yay. Thank you, Angela. I'm clapping for Angela and also for everyone who joined us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Hi.
Well, thanks to you both. I mean, this really was such a pleasure having you grace our virtual halls, and congratulations. It's such a powerful, such an amazing new work. And Angela Flournoy, thank you for doing the honors. You're such a great interviewer, and really appreciative of that. So fantastic. And all of you in the audience, thanks for coming out on your lunch break, or if you're in another time zone, great to see you all. I want to remind everyone we've posted links with which you may purchase books. Better yet, if you're in the neighborhood, you're in San Francisco, come on down, browse our stacks. We're in historic North Beach district of San Francisco. We're open 7 days a week. And we are coming back to our pre-pandemic hours. We're open from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. every day. Today's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, continuing the legacy of our founder, the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti, through public events like this one, a publishing program, and educational outreach, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So long, everyone. Please take care. We hope to see you again soon.